This is a video guide for working with QGIS and Google Slides and sequencing images from QGIS into a Google Slides format. In the presentation, we're going to go through 5 components. The first part is Google Slide dimensions, understanding what those are, taking a look at spatial bookmarks within QGIS, masking imagery to create negative space, the actual image sequencing itself, and then lining up consecutive images in Google Slides. So to get started, we want to first just simply review the dimensions that are available in Google Slides. So if we open up in Google Slides in the Drive, and we go to File, and we go to Page Setup, we can see that there's different ratios, widescreen versus standard. So typically you want to be in a widescreen 16 by 9, which is sort of modern, typical screen dimensions. So we'll go ahead and apply that. So that gives us a horizontal orientation, and that particular orientation is a width in inches of 13.3 inches by 7.5 in terms of height. So here you can see its height is 7.5. This represents a sort of typical 16 by 9, 72 dots per inch. The width here is 19 by 20 px, or pixels, and the height is 1080 pixels. That's essentially the size of this particular slide. So what we want to do is we want to export imagery outside of QGIS utilizing that same ratio. Now the problem is if we export everything out as 72 dpi, you can get away with vector line work pretty well with 72 dpi, but as soon as you start dealing with satellite imagery, you start to get some pixelation. So it would be recommended to up the dots per inch by 2 to about 144. If you go too high, if you go up into 300, which would be a print quality, you're going to create a file size that's not going to be acceptable for Google Slides. So at 144, you should be creating images that have raster data or have satellite imagery. You'd probably get those to be about 2 to maybe 3 or 4 megabytes, which is where you would want to be. So what we do here is we actually increase it to 144, and then we increase the width in terms of the px. So let's go ahead and do a basic export within QGIS for Google Slides and then bring it into Google Slides. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a basic one with the width of 1920 by 1080. Importantly, I'm going to utilize a spatial bookmark, which is the second part of this presentation. So for spatial bookmarks, what we're interested in doing here is we're interested in loading up some data into QGIS and then finding a location that we can snap to, so that we can have consistency and consecutive images that are snapped to the exact same position. So right now you can see I've moved New York City here, which is the 5 boroughs file on top of a satellite image, off to the left-hand side. And I've changed the scale from what it was to start down to 1 to 647,980 here on the bottom. Okay, now if I want to snap back to that, I've already created a spatial bookmark under user bookmarks, and it's called New York City Centered. So I'm just going to double click on this, and you can see that it brings me back to my original location. So I've sort of centered this into the middle of the screen. I have the scale at which I want to present this particular slide. But I, by happenstance, moved it off to the side here, and then I can just double click to get right back to that location. So how do you set up these bookmarks? So the way to go ahead and do this is, let's say we wanted to have a bookmark at a different scale. At this scale, what I would do is I would put it to the location that I want the bookmark to be centered and the scale at which I want it to be centered. And then I would go up to View, and under New Spatial Bookmark, I would create a new spatial bookmark. In here, I could call this one NYC Centered, and I might call this one Small Scale, or Smaller Scale. I'll just call it Small Scale. All right, so it tells me my current extent. It also tells me that I'm in a projected coordinate system, New York, Long Island, feet. And I'm going to save it, importantly, in user bookmarks. So I could also save it in project bookmarks if I want to, but here I'm going to save it under the user bookmarks tab. So I go ahead and save it, and then you can see that that shows up immediately. And I get to this through the browser window within the over on the layouts area, layouts panel. So I got layers, and then I also have my browser up here. So remember, you can always get to your browser if you need to, get to your layers by going up to View and then Panels, and then you can click those on. So here, Browser, and then I would also want to see under Panels my layer. Okay. That's all good enough. We can get to our bookmarks here, so we can toggle back and forth here, small scale, and I can go up to centered. So let's go ahead and export this first slide as a 72 dpi slide. So we're going to go up to Project. So the key here is that we're not actually going into map layout and laying out a print map layout with a legend, with titles. Here we're just going to go ahead and export for sequencing within a presentation format the actual imagery, the state at which you're trying to show a particular GIS process or a result. So here we're just going to import export off the project tab, export map to image, and here's where I have my parameters I need to change. So right now it's reading in the current map view. So if I click on map canvas extent, it's going to snap it here. I can also draw on canvas the extent that I want to show, or I could calculate from a particular layer. So in this case, I'm just going to keep it at my map canvas extent. The scale is the same as what I have my bookmark set to. The resolution is going to default to 72 dpi, and we can see the width and the output height is what we see on the screen currently. I would recommend setting up your sort of export area to be mimicking sort of a landscape orientation, kind of full screen mode. So you can see that if I were to just export this as it is right now, it'd probably line up pretty good in a Google slide in sort of a horizontal landscape page format. But what we're going to do is we're going to snap it to the exact dimensions of the slide itself. So the ratio again is 16 to 9. And on the output width, it is 1920, and the output height is 1080 for a 72 dpi. And I'm going to lock this, so you can see a little lock aspect ratio. And then I would save this, and I have a folder set up called Image Exports, or IMG Exports. PNG works pretty good, JPEGs work okay. So I'm going to keep it on the PNG format, and I'll call this 72 underscore 1920 by 1080, and I might underscore it NYC for New York City. That goes out. Okay. Now I'm going to come over to Google Slides. I have a first slide here, and I've called this slide deck sequencing example. I'm going to go ahead and insert an image, upload from computer, point it to the file, and you can see that it's 3.4 megabytes. I say open, and it places it into the first slide, and it gives it a little bit of space. So you can see that that particular aspect ratio is not at the actual edge of the slide, but if I pull it down and come right to the slide edge, it's in the same aspect ratio. And then I could present this and we can see what it looks like presented. So it looks pretty good as it is here. But if you look closely, there's a little bit of pixelation going on. The pixels in the satellite imagery are starting to get a little bit fuzzy. So let's go back and do that same process, but we're going to increase, we're going to double up the resolution and the export size. So what we're going to do here is go out down to Project, export the image. So in this case, we keep everything the same, except we increase the resolution to 150 dpi. And if we increase it, I'm sorry, not 150, we're going to increase it by 2 times, so it's going to be 144 instead of 72. The width here is going to be 3840. So we're just doubling up, and then 2160. 2160, and then we're going to lock this. And we're going to save it. And here I'm going to save it the same name, but instead I'm going to save it to 144 underscore, and then we'll call this 3840 3840, and then I want to be 2160 2160. Okay, so that's the parameters that I'm exporting. Takes a couple more seconds to export because it's a bigger file. And now what I'm going to do is make a new file. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this particular slide, and then I'm going to take it out. And let's insert an image, upload from the computer. This time we're going to get the 144. And you can see this is 12.9 megabytes. Okay, it actually does come into QGIS, which is good. If you go up much higher than this, it's probably going to stop uploading these images because they're getting too big. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this out to the edge. And then let's see the difference between these two. So if I go to present, they're in the exact same position, of course, because I used the spatial bookmark to export them at the same position, but we can see the resolution difference. Okay. So this is what we want in terms of sequencing. We want everything to be held at the exact same scale and centered location so that the user pays attention to change in the data or change in the analysis phase, and less about skipping from one scale to or one location to another. So you're retaining consistency in your slides by using the spatial bookmark. Now let's go ahead and talk about how we mask imagery to create a negative space. So if I wanted to, I have all this area outside of New York City on the slide page. If I want to get rid of that and just concentrate within the 5 boroughs of New York, how would I do that? Well, there's a few ways to do that, but one way is we could mask the imagery. So let's go ahead and do that. And everything going forward here, I'm going to be exporting at 144 dpi as opposed to 72. So the first step here is I do have a satellite base, and I've procured the satellite base through Quick Map Services. So that's a plugin. You can load that up, and that'll give you options for image bases. Remember, you don't have this actually on your hard drive. This is just being served up remotely, but you can utilize it as long as you're sourcing this imagery. So whatever product it is, you need to make sure that you're sourcing it in your slides. So in this case, it's an Esri satellite base, and I would source the Esri satellite base. So let's just go ahead and toggle off the satellite image here. So right now I have a vector feature, and what I want to do is create a minimum bounding box on whatever vector feature is going to be the outside of the subject area or the slide focus. So if I open this up and go to attributes, I can see that I have a feature or a feature component, a multi-polygon for each one of these boroughs. To get to a minimum geography, you need to have a dissolve feature. So we're going to go ahead and first dissolve this. So I'll just dissolve it. And the input's going to be the borough file, and I'll just run it and say run. And this will give me a dissolved feature in temporary memory. So if I go to open attribute table, I got one feature now. So the next step is to create the minimum geography. So we're going to go to minimum. It's called minimum bounding geometry. Okay, so minimum bounding geography, I'm going to put in the dissolve feature, and the geometry type here is going to be a bounding box. So it's going to be the envelope itself. So let's go ahead and run that and say close. And then this gives us just sort of a rectangle, the outward edge of our space. So now what I want to do is, I don't want it just to go to the outward edge. I want to have basically a white space that's going to go much farther than the exterior of New York City. So I want to go past my slide frame here. So what I'm going to do is just make this pretty aggressive. I'm just going to run a buffer on this now. So I'll go to vector features, and I'm going to go ahead and make a buffer. I'm going to input the bounding geometry. The distance I'm going to make in terms of miles. So I'm going to go out just 20 miles, and they'll get me out far enough. In my segments, I'm not going to worry about my segment count, and I'll just go ahead and run this. So this is going to create a feature that's much farther than the boundary of my slide. Okay, so I'm pretty far out at this point in time. So I'm going to go snap it back to my boroughs. So I'm going to go to zoom to layer, and then I'm going to go to my bookmark because I want to be in that location. So show spatial bookmarks. I want to be New York City centered. And we can see that New York City centered, that buffer is going to cover that full space. So I'm just going to click off buffer for a second. So my buffering is enclosing this space here. Turn this back on. Now what I want to do is I want to create a difference between the buffered space and the dissolved space. So here's the dissolved space, here's the buffered space. I want to create a difference between those two. Type in difference, and that's going to get me both the difference and then also symmetrical difference. So let's go ahead and use symmetrical difference. And here we need to get the input and the overlay correct. So we're going to input my buffered space, and the overlay, what's going to be the clipping out space, is going to be the dissolved. So I go ahead and run that, and we're kind of looking for a donut here. So if we close this, that's what we get back, is the symmetrical difference between the two. So now I can go ahead and make this just a white space if I want to. So I go to properties, and it becomes a white space because I'm creating negative space. And I say apply, say OK. And I probably want to stick my borough now on the top. Okay, so it's sitting on the outside of the mask. So now if I go up to small scale, we can see kind of what we've done here. So we originally had a buffered space. We used symmetrical difference between the buffer and the dissolve, created this sort of donut effect, and then we put in our borough layer, our vector feature on top, because in this case we want to have a outline. So let's go ahead and set up a slide sequence now with this. So I'm going to go back to New York City centered, and let's say we wanted to have two slides now. So the first slide is going to be just my project area, and I'm not going to have let's do this. Let's turn off the satellite base, and we'll just have the borough boundary. So my first slide is just going to show the borough's boundary, and then the second slide is going to show the satellite base. Okay, this is just a theoretical sequence. Doesn't really make any sense in terms of GIS analysis, but it's just an example. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is go ahead and make sure that we have the bookmark on. So we've done that. Now we're going to go to Import, Export, export the map, and this is going to be 144. My output is going to be 3840 by 2160. So 3840 by 2160. Good. I'm going to lock that down. I'm going to go ahead and say save, and I'm going to call this slide 1. Okay. And then I'm going to turn on my satellite base because that's going to be my next slide, and I'm going to do the same thing over again. Haven't changed anything in terms of the extent. 144. And since I have a bad memory, I'm going to go to 3840. And then I'm going to go to 2160. Lock it down and say save. This is going to be slide 2. And say save. Okay. So that's all done. I'm going to save the project, and then I'm going to come into Google Slides, into my slide here. I'm going to get rid of the first image and the second image that I had beforehand. And so my first image is going to be my first slide, obviously. So I come in and say new slide, not new slide. Get rid of that. First slide, and then I'm going to go ahead and insert now. Insert, upload from computer, point it to slide 1. It's a pretty small file size, 354, and bring that in. And in this case, you can see that I have the buffer edge right here, it looks like. So you may want to actually increase the size of the buffer in my example there, maybe to 35 miles, and then I wouldn't be able to see that edge. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to leave it in there. Now the next thing I want to do is, let's say that this slide's exactly the position that I want. So if I go to present, I have all this negative space around it. So I could put in title, map titles, I could put in map legends, anything extra that I want into the slide. This is just kind of the basic base map. You can think of it as a base map here for a slide. Now I want to sequence the exact same position and just change the input data essentially into the slide. So what I need to do next is I'm going to go to slide 1, insert image, and I'm inserting the slide 2 on top of slide 1. And you can see in this case it comes in right on top, which is nice. However, if you need to make adjustments, what you can do is you can click on the layer, the top layer, and you can go to Format Options. Under Format Options, you can go to Adjustments, and you can change the transparency here. And it's good that I did because we can see that there's actually a difference. Okay, so as I'm moving this along, you can see that these slides are not exactly the same in terms of how they correspond with each other. So what I'm doing now is I'm holding down my Shift key, and I'm moving around my second slide, which is on top, into position. And this is a little bit of an art. It takes a little bit of finesse to get it just right. You can also zoom in on the slide if you want to. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this from afar right now. And let's see if I can get it just right. As I'm holding down my Shift key, it's giving me small incremental moves. Okay, that's pretty close. Let's see if we can move this up. All right, that's going to have a little jiggle in it, but it's pretty close. So you can zoom in to get it right on top. So what I'm going to do now, since I have these two sitting on top of each other, I'm just going to cut this out. So I'm just going to cut it and then stick it onto the second slide. So I'm just going to paste it. And when you cut and paste, it's going to be on the exact same position. And then you want to bring that transparency back down. So you can see that there's a mistake in the slide, which is over here on the side. I have two options. I can either increase that buffer size, or I could just simply draw out a shape, a white space, to mask it on the slide itself. Let's go ahead and see the sequence now. So if we present it, that's pretty good, actually. You can see that jiggles, the second slide jiggles a little bit off to the right-hand side, upper right, but it's pretty close. So this is how to sequence a base map for Google Slides, and you typically want to do this when you don't want to do a full map layout in within QGIS. You know, you don't want to do all your titling and legends and inset maps and whatnot in the actual map layout. You just want to create a base map, and then you're going to have some additional map components that you import into the slide. And you want to set up your base map sequencing. So we're going from one slide to another slide without changing the scale and without changing the position of the base map. This is kind of how you do it. Let's go through the steps real quick once again, just as a quick overview. So what we've done is we've taken Google Slide dimensions, the aspect ratio being 16 to 9. We can use 72 dpi for vector features generally, but when you start to see pixelation, especially in your satellite imagery, you want to increase that typically to about 144, which is double the 72 dpi. Get yourself a width and a height and set it. The aspect with a little lock tool. Use your spatial bookmarks within QGIS to set up your various locations for your presentation and also the scale at which you're exporting images. You're going to utilize masking to the effect that you want to create a negative space. And again, in my case, I was getting a little bit off on the side here. So if we zoom out just a little bit, I was picking up this little edge right over here. I would probably put that buffer out to maybe 40 miles, and that would probably take care of that problem. We also did imaging sequencing, so we're going from one image to another image and sequencing so that the base map scale and position stays the same. And then we're lining those up and lining it up for consecutive slides within Google Slides. Google Slides saves on a sort of every few moments it will save. This says last edit 3 minutes ago, so you don't really have to worry about saving to update the slides as you're creating them. However, when you are finishing your slide deck, you probably want to do two things. And the first thing is that you want to set your share properties. So in this case, change to anyone with the link. Yes, I want to do that. People are going to be viewing this. They're probably not going to be editing or commenting, so set it to viewer and say done. But you really typically want to then publish it to the web. So publish it to the web. You can auto-advance these slides. If you want to just show the slides and have the user actually sequence through them, which is pretty typical, you could set it to every minute. So nobody's going to sit on a slide for more than a minute. So you know that they'll use the advanced auto-advance features in the lower left-hand side if you stick it to every minute. You could start the slideshow as soon as the player loads, restart it. But the important point here is that you want to publish it. So you have some settings down here, and you can either click on publishing or start publishing. So I'm just going to click on publish. Are you sure you want to publish this? Yes, I do. Go ahead and copy this particular link that's created. Importantly, you can see that it gives you a pub hash here at the end of the URL. Okay, so this isn't just a typical Google Drive share link. It actually is a special link for the publish. So we click on this, we go look at it, and we can see now that we have in the lower left-hand side, we have a slide advance that we can get between the slides. We can also make this full scale, and we can progress it. So we can go back and forth, and this is kind of what we want. Okay. So hopefully that helps with getting set up with sequencing within Google Slides for a presentation format as opposed to a print format, and using QGIS.